Margaret Chen stood in the marble lobby of Chen and Associates Construction, her construction company, the one she'd built from nothing while her husband David managed their joint finances, unaware that for the past 8 months, the man she'd loved for 15 years had been using her own firm to hide $100 million he'd secretly moved from their account to start a new life with his mistress. David had already filed for divorce, already proposed to Claire with a ring, bought using Margaret's money, already celebrated their future in the penthouse Margaret's profits had purchased. But on this gray November morning, as Margaret's forensic accountant laid 300 pages of transactions across her desk, she discovered shell companies, falsified invoices, and construction projects that never existed, all routing their joint fortune through the very business David never knew she owned, the company whose name she'd kept separate, the empire he'd dismissed as her little hobby. What Margaret did next didn't just expose the theft, it crushed David's future, destroyed Claire's dreams, and left them both with nothing but handcuffs and headlines. How did a woman's society called the Quiet Wife dismantle 2 lives so completely they'd never recover? What kind of revenge burns so precisely it looks like justice? And what darkness had been hiding behind David Chen's perfect smile all along? Margaret's fingers trembled as she traced the line connecting transaction 4782 to a shell company called Riverside Development LLC. The November rain hammered against her office windows on the 42nd floor, each drop a tiny explosion against glass. But she barely heard it. For 8 months, 8 entire months, David had been siphoning money from their joint account, and for 8 months he'd been laundering it through construction projects that bore her company's invoices, but had never broken ground. "Mrs. Chen, are you all right?" Robert Kim, her forensic accountant, pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose, his young face creased with concern. He'd been with Chen and Associates for only 6 months, hired specifically because Margaret had begun noticing discrepancies in project budgets that her senior staff couldn't explain. She'd thought it was simple embezzlement by a site manager. She'd never imagined this. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She was reading an invoice for $847,000 worth of steel beams supposedly delivered to the Grandview Towers project in March. But Grandview Towers was her project, her design, and it had used composite materials, not steel. Someone had created a fake invoice using her company's letterhead, and the money had flowed into Riverside Development LLC, which according to Robert's investigation was owned by a David M. Chen. Her David, her husband of 15 years, the same man who'd kissed her goodbye that very morning, who'd complained about the traffic on the 405, who'd told her he had late meetings all week, the same man who'd made love to her 3 nights ago and whispered that she was his forever. The total? Margaret's voice came out steadier than she expected. She'd learned to be steady. Growing up in her grandmother's 1-bedroom apartment in Koreatown, watching her mother work 3 jobs after her father left, Margaret had learned that survival required a spine made of iron wrapped in silk. $97,462,000. Robert's voice dropped on the final number. "And that's just what I've found so far. Mrs. Chen, the joint account you and your husband maintained, it's almost empty. There's $143,000 left. Everything else has been moved through these shell companies over the past 8 months." The room tilted slightly, but Margaret gripped the edge of her desk. The rain intensified, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed. Her mind raced backward, searching for signs she'd missed. 8 months ago was February. Valentine's Day, David had given her diamond earrings and taken her to Nobu, where he'd been distracted, checking his phone every 5 minutes. She'd assumed it was work stress. He was a financial consultant for high-net-worth individuals, always juggling demanding clients. But now, staring at Robert's spreadsheets, Margaret saw a different picture forming. February was when the wire transfers had begun. Small ones at first, $50,000 here, $75,000 there, buried among legitimate transfers for household expenses and investments. By June, David had grown bolder, $4.3 million in a single week, disguised as payment for a hospital renovation project that Chen and Associates had actually completed, except the money had gone to Riverside Development instead of her company's accounts. "He used my company," Margaret said slowly, the full horror of it settling into her bones. He knew I kept Chen and Associates separate from our personal finances. I never told him the details because he always said my business bored him. He used that against me. Robert nodded grimly. There's more. I cross-referenced the shell companies with property records. Riverside Development LLC purchased a penthouse at the Meridian building 6 months ago. Cash purchase, $12 million. Margaret knew the Meridian. She'd designed the facade consultation for it. The penthouses had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, private elevators, wine cellars. She and David had toured one once 3 years ago when they'd been discussing upgrading from their house in Pacific Palisades. David had called it excessive and wasteful, but apparently it wasn't too excessive for whatever life he'd been planning without her. Her phone buzzed. David's name flashed across the screen. Working late again. Don't wait up. Something inside Margaret cracked, but not in the way David would have wanted. Not into pieces, but into something harder. Something crystalline and sharp. She didn't respond to his text. Instead, she looked at Robert. I need everything, she said. Every transaction, every shell company, every property purchase, every dinner receipt. I need his phone records if you can get them legally. I need a timeline of exactly when every dollar moved and where it went. Robert hesitated. Mrs. Chen, this is evidence of massive fraud. We should contact the authorities. Not yet. Margaret stood, smoothing her black Armani suit, the one she'd worn to close the Richardson Hotel deal last month. The deal that had brought in $23 million in revenue, money that should have secured their future. First, I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with. My husband is a financial consultant. He's careful. If there's money missing, there's a reason he thought he could get away with it. She walked to the window, looking down at the city sprawled below, lights beginning to flicker on as evening approached. Down there, somewhere, David was living a second life. Down there, he'd built a future that didn't include her, using the money she'd helped earn, laundering it through the company she'd built from nothing. Margaret thought back to the beginning, to when they'd met at UCLA. She'd been a graduate student in architecture, working part-time at a coffee shop to pay rent. He'd been finishing his MBA, confident and charming, with plans to revolutionize wealth management. They'd married 6 months after graduation, young and full of dreams. She'd started Chen and Associates in their spare bedroom, taking small residential projects while David built his consulting firm. For years, they'd been partners. Real partners. David had encouraged her to bid on her first major commercial project. She'd supported him through the brutal early years when clients were scarce. They'd celebrated together, struggled together, built a life together, or so she'd thought. But looking at Robert's evidence, Margaret saw a different story. She saw a man who'd waited patiently until her company was successful enough to exploit. A man who'd studied her business carefully enough to forge convincing documents. A man who'd planned his exit for months, maybe years, while sleeping beside her every night. There's one more thing, Robert said quietly, pulling up a document on his laptop. I found a marriage license application, filed 2 weeks ago in Nevada. David Chen and Claire Westbrook. The wedding is scheduled for December 20th. December 20th, their anniversary. Margaret and David had married on December 20th, 15 years ago, in a small ceremony at the Japanese garden in Van Nuys. Her grandmother had made her dress. David's parents had flown in from Boston. They'd promised forever. Now he was promising forever to someone else, on the same date, using money he'd stolen from her. Margaret turned away from the window. Claire Westbrook. Who is she? Robert pulled up a LinkedIn profile. A blonde woman in her late 20s smiled from the screen, attractive in that polished, generic way of Instagram influencers. She's a marketing director at Coastal Ventures. They're one of your husband's clients. According to the timeline, she and David started working together about 14 months ago. 14 months before the theft began, which meant David had met Claire, started an affair, and then systematically planned how to move their entire fortune without Margaret noticing. The premeditation of it was breathtaking. Find out everything about Claire Westbrook, Margaret said. Where she lives, what she drives, what she owes, what she wants. If she knows about the stolen money, she's complicit. If she doesn't know, she needs to. Robert closed his laptop. Mrs. Chen, what are you planning? Margaret smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile her grandmother used to wear when neighborhood landlords tried to cheat her on rent. The smile that said, "You've made a terrible mistake, and now you'll learn why." I'm planning to give my husband exactly what he deserves, Margaret said. He wanted to use my company to hide his theft. Then my company will be the instrument of his destruction. Every transaction he made, every fake invoice, every shell company, it all points back to him. And when I'm done, David won't just lose the money, he'll lose everything. She thought of the penthouse at the Meridian, purchased with her money. She thought of Claire Westbrook's engagement ring, bought with her labor. She thought of 15 years of marriage reduced to a pile of forged documents and wire transfers. But most of all, she thought of her grandmother, who'd survived war and immigration and poverty by being smarter and tougher than anyone expected. Her grandmother had taught her that revenge was a dish best served cold, but justice was a dish best served methodically, with receipts and witnesses and ironclad evidence. Get me everything by tomorrow, Margaret said. And Robert, not a word to anyone. The moment David knows we've discovered this, he'll run. I want him comfortable. I want him confident. I want him to think he's gotten away with it. After Robert left, Margaret sat alone in her office as darkness fell completely over the city. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the shadows, thinking about the woman she'd been this morning, trusting, loving, blind, and the woman she'd become in the space of 3 hours. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from David. Love you. See you late tonight. This time Margaret responded, Love you too. 2 words, 2 lies. But David had lied for 8 months, so what was one more night of deception? Margaret didn't sleep. How could she, knowing that the man breathing softly beside her had spent months systematically destroying their life together? She lay rigid in their California king bed, watching the ceiling fan rotate slowly in the darkness, listening to David's steady breathing, and thinking about Claire Westbrook's perfect LinkedIn smile. At 4:47 a.m., David's phone vibrated on his nightstand. Margaret watched through slitted eyes as he reached for it, squinting at the screen. His face softened into an expression she hadn't seen in months. Genuine warmth, real affection. He typed something quickly, smiled, and set the phone down. But he didn't go back to sleep immediately. He lay there staring at the ceiling, and Margaret saw him touch his left ring finger, spinning his wedding band absently. Was he thinking about Claire? About the penthouse they'd bought? About December 20th, when he'd replaced Margaret with a newer model? When David's alarm went off at 6:30, Margaret pretended to wake up. She went through their morning routine with mechanical precision. Coffee, toast, small talk about their respective days. David mentioned a client meeting in Santa Monica. Margaret mentioned a site inspection in Long Beach. They kissed goodbye at the door, the same peck on the lips they'd exchanged 10,000 times before. Have a good day, David said, straightening his Tom Ford tie. You too, Margaret replied, and watched him drive away in the BMW they'd bought together 3 years ago. Except she realized they hadn't bought it together. She'd bought it. Her money, her company, her work. David had just been along for the ride, waiting for the right moment to jump ship. At the office, Robert was already waiting with 2 bankers' boxes full of documents. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red. I found more, he said without preamble. A lot more. Over the next 6 hours, Robert walked Margaret through a conspiracy so elaborate it took her breath away. David hadn't just stolen their money, he'd created an entire phantom construction empire using Chen and Associates as the front. 15 shell companies, all with similar names. Riverside Development, Westside Construction Partners, Coastal Building Group. Each one had been carefully crafted to look legitimate, with business licenses, tax ID numbers, and bank accounts. But none of them were real. They existed only on paper, vehicles to move money from the joint account into David's control. He'd been depositing the stolen funds into these shell companies, then transferring them to real estate purchases, stock investments, and a private account in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman account has $47 million in it, Robert said, showing her the bank statements he'd obtained through a private investigator. He opened it 4 months ago. I think he was planning to move everything offshore and disappear. Margaret stared at the numbers. $47 million, sitting in a Caribbean bank account, while she worked 70-hour weeks to keep Chen and Associates profitable. What about Claire? Does she know? Robert pulled up a series of photographs. Claire Westbrook at a jewelry store in Beverly Hills trying on engagement rings. Claire and David at Shutters on the beach, holding hands over dinner. Claire touring the Meridian penthouse, her face lit with excitement as she gestured at the ocean view. She knows, Robert said quietly. These photos are from my investigator. Claire Westbrook quit her job at Coastal Ventures 3 months ago. According to her social media, which is private, but my guy has ways, she's been planning a wedding. She's registered at Geary's and Bloomingdale's. The wedding is at the Four Seasons Maui. She's invited 150 guests. A destination wedding in Maui on Margaret's anniversary, using Margaret's money. There's something else, Robert said, and his tone made Margaret look up sharply. I pulled the divorce papers. David filed them 6 weeks ago. He's claiming irreconcilable differences and requesting a 50-50 split of all marital assets. Margaret laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to etch glass. A 50-50 split of the $143,000 he left in our account? How generous. There's more. In the filing, David claims that your company, Chen and Associates, is your separate property and shouldn't be included in the marital estate. He's positioning himself as the magnanimous husband who's not trying to take your business. Of course he was, because David knew that if Chen and Associates were included in the divorce proceedings, the forensic accountants would discover his fraud. By claiming the company was separate property, he protected himself from scrutiny while looking noble. Margaret stood and walked to her wall of windows, looking down at the city again. Somewhere down there, David was probably with Claire, planning their future. Maybe they were picking out furniture for the penthouse. Maybe they were booking excursions in Maui. Maybe Claire was showing her friends her engagement ring, laughing about how she'd stolen a rich man from his boring wife. But Claire didn't know who she was dealing with. Neither did David. Margaret had been underestimated her entire life. Teachers who assumed she'd drop out, classmates who thought she'd gotten into UCLA through affirmative action, clients who questioned whether a young Korean woman could handle major construction projects. She'd proven them all wrong by being better prepared, more thorough, and more ruthless when necessary. Robert, I need you to do something for me, Margaret said, turning from the window. I need you to create a comprehensive report documenting every fraudulent transaction. I need dates, amounts, account numbers, copies of the forged invoices. I need it to be so detailed that a first-year law student could prosecute this case. That'll take a few days. You have 24 hours. I'm meeting with my attorney tomorrow afternoon, and I need this evidence airtight. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled to a name. Patricia Morrison, the most aggressive divorce attorney in Los Angeles. Patricia had represented 3 of Margaret's clients in brutal divorces, and she destroyed their opponents with surgical precision. After you finish the report, I need you to do something else, Margaret continued. I need you to identify every asset David purchased with the stolen money. The penthouse, the Cayman account, stock portfolios, everything. And I need you to find out if he's hidden anything else. Men like David always have a backup plan. Robert nodded, making notes. What about the divorce? Are you going to respond to his filing? Margaret smiled that same cold smile from yesterday. Oh, I'll respond, but not the way he expects. That evening, Margaret came home to an empty house. David's text said he'd be late again. Client dinner in Beverly Hills. Margaret knew it was really dinner with Claire, probably at some trendy restaurant where they could celebrate their approaching freedom. She poured herself a glass of the Camus Cabernet they'd been saving for their anniversary and sat in David's home office. She'd rarely entered this room during their marriage. It was his space, filled with his books on investment strategies and wealth management. Framed photos lined his desk, their wedding day, a trip to Santorini, Christmas at his parents' house. Margaret studied the wedding photo, looking at their younger selves. She'd been 26, wearing her grandmother's modified Hanbok-inspired dress, looking at David like he'd hung the moon. and he'd looked at her the same way, or so she'd thought. Had it been real? Or had she been a convenient stepping stone, a partner to help him build wealth until he found someone better? She opened David's desk drawers methodically. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she found it. A small velvet box tucked behind a stack of tax returns. Inside was a ring, not her engagement ring, but a different one. Bigger diamond, more modern setting. The receipt was tucked beneath it. Tiffany & Co., $87,000. Purchased 6 months ago with a credit card Margaret had never seen. 6 months ago. Right when David had bought the Meridian penthouse. Right when he'd started moving money in larger chunks. Margaret photographed the ring and receipt, then carefully replaced everything. She was building a case, piece by piece, transaction by transaction. By the time she was done, David would have nowhere to run and no way to deny what he'd done. Her phone rang. Patricia Morrison. Margaret, I got your message. I've cleared my calendar for tomorrow at 2. But I have to tell you, if what you're saying is true, this isn't just a divorce case. This is criminal fraud. Your husband could go to prison. I know, Margaret said calmly. There was a pause. Good. Bring everything you have. I'll bring the fire. At 11:30, David came home smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't Margaret's. He kissed her cheek absently, said he was exhausted, and went straight to shower. Margaret lay in bed listening to the water run and thought about Claire Westbrook spraying her perfume on David's neck. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow everything changes. Patricia Morrison's office occupied the 38th floor of a Century City high-rise, with views stretching from downtown to the Pacific. Patricia herself was a striking woman in her 50s, silver hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing Armani, and an expression that suggested she ate weak opponents for breakfast. Jesus Christ, Patricia breathed, flipping through Robert's report for the 3rd time. I've seen some brazen fraud in my 28 years of practice, but this is next level. Your husband used your own company to launder nearly $100 million, and he's trying to divorce you while keeping it all? That's the summary, yes, Margaret said. She'd barely slept again, surviving on coffee and cold fury. Patricia set down the report and fixed Margaret with an assessing stare. Before we proceed, I need to know what you want, because we have options here. We can go the purely civil route, divorce, sue for return of marital assets, bankrupt him financially, or we can go nuclear, involve the DA, press criminal charges, and send your husband to federal prison for wire fraud, money laundering, and theft. The criminal route is riskier and takes longer, but the satisfaction quotient is higher. Margaret had been thinking about this all night. The practical part of her, the part that had built a $200 million construction firm from nothing, knew the smart move was to recover the money and move on. Cut her losses, rebuild, survive. But the part of her that had loved David for 15 years, that had trusted him completely, that had shared everything with him, that part wanted to watch him burn. Both, Margaret said. I want to destroy him financially and see him prosecuted criminally. I want Claire Westbrook to know exactly what kind of man she's marrying. I want everyone who's ever known David Chen to understand what he really is. And I want every penny back, plus damages. Patricia smiled, and it was a predator's smile. Music to my ears. Here's what we're going to do. Over the next 3 hours, Patricia laid out a strategy that was breathtaking in its thoroughness. First, they'd file an emergency motion to freeze all of David's assets, including the shell company accounts, the Cayman Island funds, and the Meridian penthouse. They'd serve him with divorce papers that included a full accounting of his fraud. Simultaneously, Patricia would contact the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division with Robert's evidence. The key is timing, Patricia explained. We hit him with everything at once before he has a chance to move assets or flee. I've worked with the DA's office before. They love cases like this because they're easy wins. Rich guy steals from his wife, thinks he's smarter than everyone, gets caught. It plays beautifully in court and in the media. The media? Margaret asked. Oh, honey, this story is catnip for journalists. Wealthy financial consultant uses his wife's construction company to steal $100 million and run off with his mistress. The LA Times will eat it up. TMZ will have a field day. And that public scrutiny will make it much harder for David to negotiate or disappear. Margaret nodded slowly. Part of her hated the idea of her private life splashed across tabloids, but another part, the part that had been humiliated and betrayed, wanted the world to know what David had done. "What about Claire?" Margaret asked. "Can she be charged as an accomplice?" Patricia consulted her notes. "Depends on what she knew and when. If she knew the money was stolen, she's potentially liable for receiving stolen property. If she didn't know, she's just a gold digger who picked the wrong mark. My investigator will interview her neighbors, friends, colleagues. We'll figure out her level of involvement." "I want her interviewed after David is arrested," Margaret said. "I want her to know her fairy tale ending just turned into a nightmare." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "You're really out for blood, aren't you?" "My husband spent 8 months stealing from me while I slept beside him," Margaret said quietly. "He looked me in the eyes, told me he loved me, and then transferred millions of dollars to impress his mistress. Yes, Patricia, I want blood." "Good," Patricia said, closing her folder. "Righteous anger makes for excellent courtroom testimony. Now here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, we'll file all our motions. By tomorrow afternoon, David will be served at his office. By tomorrow evening, the DA will have our evidence package. By Friday, there'll be a warrant for his arrest. That fast? White-collar fraud moves slowly unless you know how to push the right buttons. I know every judge in the Superior Court and half the prosecutors in the DA's office. When I tell them I have a slam-dunk case, they listen." Patricia stood, offering her hand. "Go home, Margaret. Get some rest. The next few weeks are going to be intense, and you'll need your strength." Margaret shook her hand, feeling the firm grip of a woman who destroyed countless men in divorce court. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me after we've taken everything from him and watched him put on an orange jumpsuit." That evening, Margaret made dinner, something she hadn't done in months. Pork belly lettuce wraps, David's favorite, with all the traditional banchan side dishes. She set the table with their wedding china, lit candles, opened a bottle of expensive wine. When David came home at 7:30, he looked surprised. "What's all this?" "I thought we should have a nice dinner together," Margaret said, smiling. "We've both been so busy lately. I miss us." Something shifted in David's expression. Was it guilt, regret, or just annoyance that his wife was complicating his exit strategy? But he sat down, and they ate together like they had 1,000 times before. Margaret asked about his day, and David spun elaborate lies about client meetings and market strategies. She asked about his travel plans for the holidays, and David said he'd probably need to visit his parents in Boston. No mention of Maui. No mention of Claire. No mention of the wedding scheduled for December 20th. "David," Margaret said, refilling his wine glass, "are you happy?" He looked at her, startled. "What kind of question is that?" "I'm serious. Are you happy with our life? With me?" David set down his fork. For a moment, she thought he might tell her the truth. She saw something flicker in his eyes, the ghost of the man she'd married, the one who'd promised forever. But then his face closed, and he reached across the table to take her hand. "Of course I'm happy. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." Lies, all lies. And Margaret sat there, holding the hand of a man who'd stolen her future, and smiled like her heart wasn't made of ice and rage. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," David replied. And Margaret thought, tomorrow, you'll understand what love really costs. Thursday morning arrived with unusual clarity, the kind of Southern California weather that made tourists think they discovered paradise. Margaret dressed carefully, her navy St. John's suit, pearl earrings, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She looked like exactly what she was, a successful businesswoman in complete control. David left for work at his usual time, whistling as he grabbed his briefcase. Margaret watched from the window as he drove away, wondering if this was the last time he'd leave their house as a free man. At 9 a.m., Patricia Morrison filed their motions with the Superior Court. At 9:30, the judge, a woman named Evelyn Hartley, who'd been on the bench for 20 years and had no patience for fraud, signed the emergency orders freezing David's assets. At 10 a.m., a process server walked into David's office in downtown LA and handed him the divorce petition along with notice of the asset freeze. Margaret wasn't there to see his face, but Patricia had arranged for the process server to wear a hidden camera. Later, Margaret would watch the video. David's confusion, then shock, then pure terror as he read the allegations. Wire fraud, money laundering, theft of $97.4 million. Request for criminal prosecution. According to the process server's report, David had turned white, sat down heavily, and immediately reached for his phone. He called someone, probably Claire, and Margaret could only imagine that conversation. "Baby, there's been a mistake. My crazy wife thinks I stole money. Don't worry, I'll fix this." But David couldn't fix this. By noon, every account he controlled was frozen. The Meridian penthouse had a lien on it. His shell companies were locked down. The Cayman Island Bank had been contacted by federal authorities and ordered to freeze his account pending investigation. At 2 p.m., FBI Special Agent Monica Torres and Assistant DA Richard Walsh arrived at Chen & Associates to interview Margaret. Patricia was there, of course, and Robert had prepared presentation materials that would have made a Fortune 500 CFO proud. Agent Torres was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and sharper questions. She went through Robert's evidence page by page, occasionally stopping to make notes or request clarification. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Torres said finally, "in my 15 years investigating white-collar crime, I've never seen documentation this thorough. Your forensic accountant deserves a medal." Robert, sitting quietly in the corner, blushed. "The question is," DA Walsh continued, "are you prepared for what comes next? Your husband will be arrested. There will be a trial. Your private life will be scrutinized. Defense attorneys will try to paint you as a vindictive ex-wife making false accusations. This won't be easy." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "My husband stole $100 million from me using my own company as a cover. He planned to divorce me, marry his mistress, and leave me with nothing. I'm prepared for whatever it takes to see justice done." Agent Torres nodded. "Good. We'll present this to a grand jury tomorrow. Given the evidence, I expect we'll have an indictment by Monday and a warrant by Tuesday. Is your husband a flight risk? He has a Cayman Island account with $47 million in it," Patricia said dryly. "What do you think?" "We'll coordinate with his attorney once he retains one," Agent Torres said, "assuming he hasn't already fled to a non-extradition country." But David hadn't fled. That evening, as Margaret sat in her office watching the sunset, she got a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Margaret." David's voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do." "Please, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I can explain everything." Margaret laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut. "Explain what, David? Explain Riverside Development LLC? Explain the Meridian penthouse? Explain Claire Westbrook? Explain the $97 million you stole from our joint account?" Silence then. "How did you went through through what? Through the construction invoices that bore my company's name? Through the shell companies you created using my business as a front? David, you used Chen & Associates to launder stolen money. My company, the one you always said bored you, the one you never asked about because you were too busy planning your new life." "It wasn't like that," David's voice cracked. "I was going to pay it all back. I made some investments. They didn't pan out. I needed time to recover the losses." "Stop lying." Margaret stood pacing her office. "I have every transaction. I have the Tiffany receipt for Claire's ring. I have photos of you two at restaurants I design. I have your marriage license application for December 20th, our anniversary. You didn't make bad investments. You stole our money to build a new life with your mistress." "Margaret, please, no, you don't get to please me. You don't get to explain or apologize or make excuses. Tomorrow, the FBI is presenting evidence to a grand jury. By next week, there will be a warrant for your arrest. You're going to prison, David. And you know what? You deserve it." She hung up. Her hand was shaking, adrenaline flooding her system. But underneath the anger was something else. Grief. Grief for 15 years of marriage that had been a lie. Grief for the man she'd thought she'd known. Grief for the life they'd built together that turned out to be nothing but a carefully constructed fraud. Her phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number with a 310 area code. Margaret answered. "Is this Margaret Chen?" A young woman's voice, tight with emotion. "Who is this?" "Claire Westbrook. I think we need to talk." Margaret's first instinct was to hang up, but curiosity stopped her. "What could we possibly have to discuss?" "David told me you were separated." Claire's voice was shaking. "He said you'd agreed to an amicable divorce. He said you kept your finances separate. He never told me about stealing money, about the shell companies, about any of it." "And you believed him?" Margaret kept her voice cold. "Yes, why wouldn't I? He's a financial consultant. He manages money for billionaires. I thought he was successful on his own." Margaret walked to her window, looking down at the city lights. "So what do you want from me, Claire? Absolution? Understanding? Permission to marry my husband? I want to know if it's true." Claire was crying now. "Did David really steal $100 million from you? Is the penthouse, is everything we have, is it all stolen?" "Yes." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "Oh my God!" Claire's voice broke completely. "Oh my God, I quit my job. I told my family. I invited 150 people to our wedding. We're supposed to get married in 6 weeks." "December 20th, Margaret said, "on my anniversary, using my money, while living in a penthouse purchased with funds laundered through my construction company." Claire made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. "I didn't know. Margaret, I swear to God, I didn't know. If I had known..." "What? You wouldn't have dated a married man? You wouldn't have accepted an engagement ring bought with stolen money? You wouldn't have moved into a penthouse his wife's company paid for?" Margaret's voice was ice. "You knew enough, Claire. You knew he was married. You knew he had a wife. You just didn't care as long as the money kept flowing. That's not... I thought... He said you were getting divorced." "We weren't. He filed papers 6 weeks ago without telling me. 6 weeks, Claire. While he was still sleeping in my bed and eating dinner at my table. So save your tears. You chose to be with a married man. Now you get to live with the consequences." Margaret hung up and blocked the number. She felt no satisfaction from Claire's tears. Destroying the mistress wasn't the goal. Destroying David was. At 10 p.m., Margaret's phone buzzed with a news alert. Los Angeles financial consultant under investigation for $100 million fraud. The story had leaked. Patricia had warned this might happen. Someone at the courthouse or DA's office talking to a reporter they trusted. Margaret opened the article. There was her wedding photo, the one from David's office with their faces visible. The story laid out the basics. Prominent financial consultant accused of stealing from joint marital account, using wife's construction company to launder funds, fleeing to Mistress with the money. The comments section was already filling up. "How stupid do you have to be to steal money through your wife's company?" "Another rich dude thinking he can buy a younger model. Hope he rots in prison." "Feel bad for the wife. She built a business and her husband destroyed it. $100 million? How do you not notice $100 million is missing?" Margaret closed the article. Tomorrow her phone would ring nonstop. Tomorrow reporters would camp outside Chen and Associates. Tomorrow her life would become a public spectacle. But tonight, she poured another glass of wine and sat in the dark, thinking about David sitting somewhere, maybe at a hotel, maybe at Claire's apartment, realizing his perfect plan had collapsed. She thought about him reading the news story, seeing his face attached to words like fraud and theft and arrest, and she felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The arrest happened on Tuesday morning at 7 a.m., just as David was leaving a hotel near LAX. According to Agent Torres, who called Margaret personally, David had been preparing to flee. He'd withdrawn cash, bought a one-way ticket to Panama City, and packed a single suitcase. "We got him at the curb," Agent Torres said. "He saw our badges and tried to run. Made it about 15 feet before my partner tackled him. It's all on body cam footage. The DA is going to love it." Margaret was in her office when she got the call, having spent another sleepless night preparing for the media storm. "Is he in custody now?" "He's being processed at the downtown jail. Arraignment is scheduled for 2 p.m. Given the flight risk and the amount stolen, I expect the judge will set bail at $10 million or deny it entirely." After hanging up, Margaret allowed herself one moment of pure vindication. David had tried to run. He'd actually tried to flee to a country with no extradition treaty, which meant he'd never intended to explain or apologize or return the money. He'd planned to disappear with Claire in their stolen fortune, leaving Margaret with nothing, but he'd failed. And now he'd spend the next few years in prison, thinking about that failure every single day. Patricia called an hour later. "Have you seen the news? It's everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. You're trending on Twitter. The angle everyone's running is financial consultant stupid enough to steal through wife's own company." "I saw. David's attorney called me. Jeffrey Goldman from Goldman and Associates. Predictable choice. He handles white-collar criminals with money. Wants to discuss a plea deal." Margaret felt her heart rate spike. Already? Jeffrey's smart. He knows this case is unwinnable. The evidence is overwhelming. David tried to flee, and the optics are terrible. A jury will hate your husband, so Goldman wants to negotiate before the DA piles on more charges. What kind of deal? He didn't specify yet, but typically in cases like this, they'll offer to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. Instead of 20 years, maybe 10, maybe 8 with good behavior. In exchange, David agrees to return all stolen assets and waive his rights to any marital property. Margaret was quiet, thinking, and if we don't take a plea deal, we go to trial, which could take a year or more. During that time, the assets remain frozen. You can't access them either. And there's always a small chance David's attorney finds some procedural error or convinces a jury that this was all a misunderstanding. It's unlikely, but possible. What do you recommend? Patricia paused. Honestly, I want to see him squirm. I want a trial. I want to cross-examine him on the stand and watch him try to explain why he needed 15 shell companies and a Cayman Island account. But that's my ego talking. Practically speaking, a plea deal gets you your money back faster and guarantees a conviction. Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking down at the city where David was sitting in a jail cell. She thought about him in an orange jumpsuit, being fingerprinted and photographed. She thought about him calling Claire, trying to explain. She thought about him realizing that the wife he'd dismissed as boring had destroyed him completely. "No deal," Margaret said. "I want a trial. I want every detail made public. I want everyone to see exactly what he did and how long he planned it. The money matters, but making sure he's exposed matters more." "You're sure? This could get ugly." "I'm sure." "All right then, trial it is. I'll let Goldman know we're rejecting any plea offers. See you at the arraignment." The arraignment was a circus. Margaret sat in the gallery with Patricia, watching reporters pack every available seat. When David was let in wearing a jail-issued jumpsuit, Margaret studied him carefully. He looked terrible, unshaven, exhausted, haunted. His eyes scanned the courtroom and locked onto hers for just a moment. What did he see? The woman he'd betrayed? The business partner he'd exploited? The wife who'd trusted him completely? Or did he finally see what Margaret had become? Someone who wouldn't be dismissed, disrespected, or destroyed. Judge Hartley, the same judge who'd signed the asset freeze, presided over the arraignment with brisk efficiency. David pleaded not guilty, which surprised no one. His attorney, Jeffrey Goldman, argued for reasonable bail, citing David's ties to the community and clean record. The DA countered by pointing out that David had been caught literally fleeing the country. "Your Honor," DA Walsh said, "the defendant withdrew $50,000 in cash, purchased a one-way ticket to Panama, and was arrested at the airport. He's not just a flight risk, he actively attempted to flee. Additionally, he stole nearly $100 million and has access to offshore accounts we may not have identified yet. I'm requesting bail be denied entirely." Judge Hartley looked down at David with an expression of absolute contempt. "Mr. Chen, you used your wife's construction company to perpetrate massive fraud, hid money in offshore accounts, and tried to flee the country when caught. The only reason you're standing in my courtroom instead of somewhere over the Pacific Ocean is because the FBI was doing their job. Bail is denied. Trial is set for February 3rd. Defendant will remain in custody." The gavel came down. David's face crumpled. He turned to look at Margaret again, and this time his expression was pleading. She stared back with empty eyes and didn't move. That evening, Margaret stood in her empty house, looking at the spaces David had occupied. His home office, his side of the closet, his chair at the dining table. He'd existed in every room, and now he was gone. Not dead, but erased, locked in a cell downtown. She thought about Claire Westbrook, who, according to Patricia's investigators, had moved back in with her parents and deactivated all her social media accounts. Claire's dream of being a wealthy man's wife had evaporated in a single week. She thought about the Meridian penthouse, sitting empty, a monument to David's greed and stupidity. But mostly, Margaret thought about her grandmother, who died 2 years ago. Her grandmother who'd survived Japanese occupation, civil war, and immigration with nothing but determination. Her grandmother who'd told Margaret over and over, "Be strong, be smart. Never let anyone make you small." David had tried to make her small. He'd dismissed her company, stolen her money, and planned to discard her like she was nothing. But Margaret wasn't nothing. She was the woman who'd built Chen & Associates from a spare bedroom to a $200 million firm. She was the architect who designed half the skyline David could see from his jail cell. She was the granddaughter of a woman who taught her that survival meant being harder than whatever tried to break you. And David Chen, charming, confident David, who'd thought he was smarter than everyone, was learning that lesson the hardest way possible. Margaret poured herself one last glass of wine and raised it toward the city lights. "To justice," she said to the empty room, "and to crushing those who deserve it." The wine tasted like victory.